Anyways, okay, so good couple more people logging on, but let's get started. So we're happy to have Ahmad here, and Fareed is around too. So I think if you'd like to ask questions in the chat room, Fareed can respond to them as well. But otherwise, just unmute yourself and break in as needed. You have an hour, Ahmad. Go ahead and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much for including this paper on the program, and I'm very happy to present this relatively new paper, and I'm really looking forward to the feedback. So the paper is about trade firm delocation and optimal climate policy, and the motivation behind the paper is that if you go and read the news, you'll realize that the existing climate agreements like the Kyoto Protocol or the Kyoto Agreement or the Paris Climate Accord, they're basically being criticized for not delivering desired outcomes. And if you look at what the reason is, I think Nordhaus in his 2015 AER article clearly lays out the problem with the existing trade agreements. It's a free riding problem. So basically the idea is that under the current system, countries have an incentive to benefit from the other country's abatement activity and do not take a proportionate abatement measures themselves. So that's the problem, and it's proven difficult to enforce cooperation. And then if you go read the news more recently, you'll realize that experts are articulating two proposals going forward. So how do we overcome this big free riding problem? Well, there's one proposal that says, well, use trade policy as a second best solution. Tax carbon at the border. For example, a climate conscious country or economic region like the EU can use its border carbon tariffs to reduce carbon emissions in Asia. And that's going to some extent resolve the problem of non-cooperation because you're directly taxing carbon in the rest of the world with your trade policy instruments. There's a second proposal, which is actually due to Nordhaus mostly. It's the Climate Club proposal, which says that climate conscious governments, instead of relying on the good faith of other players, they can just form a climate club. And the Climate Club operates as follows. They basically say that every member has to apply the globally optimum carbon tax. And then non-members, they have two options. They either join the Climate Club and have to raise their carbon tax accordingly, or they can stay out, but they will face trade penalties. So the Climate Club members, they basically use their collective market power to penalize non-cooperating governments. And by doing so, they create incentives for governments to join the Climate Club, and they disincentivize leaving the Climate Club or the free riding problem. So these are the two proposals. They're well known. You've probably seen a lot of articles on these two proposals, and many studies have analyzed some variation of proposals 1 and 2, but they have limitations. So the existing studies have limitations that, if I wanted to summarize these limitations very briefly, on the theory side, a lot of the theoretical models of optimal climate policy, they ignore or overlook firm delocation in response to policy, scale economies and abatement, and multilateral carbon leakage. A lot of these models are based on two country, two good partial equilibrium models and perfect competition. And the quantitative studies on the topic usually look at arbitrarily chosen or suboptimal carbon tariffs or trade penalties. Now, that is not necessarily bad, but it doesn't uncover the full potential of these two proposals I just mentioned. And I'm going to show you this, make this point with a very crude graphical illustration. So think about this, the different states of the world based on how much carbon tariffs different countries are applying. There's the status quo, which we're clearly unhappy about because there's not enough taxing of carbon. Then there's the optimal tax on carbon. And the question, is what is the full potential of carbon taxes or a climate club with good trade penalties? Well, we have to identify this optimal carbon tax, right? That's difficult. That's difficult to calculate numerically because it requires a multi-dimensional and often NP-hard optimization problem. Because you have many players, they can retaliate, they're strategic. So what do a lot of the existing analyses do? They look at an arbitrarily chosen carbon tax rate or carbon tariff that is above the status quo rate. Now that's good because it gives us a partial effectiveness, so that it identifies a partial effectiveness. It's easier to compute. But again, we may be, I mean, really, we're still interested in this full effectiveness of the carbon tariff. And that's what we're going to do in this paper. So this is our paper. It's going to be a GE multi-industry, multi-country model of trade with transboundary carbon externality and scale economies in production and abatement. The modeling side is not super innovative. It's basically Krugman meets Coupland and Taylor. And what we really do with this model is the following. First, we derive simple analytic formulas for optimal local carbon taxes and border adjustment carbon tariffs. Now, what do we do with these analytic formulas? We map the model and the formulas to data. And once we do this, we first uncover some previously unknown trade-offs facing carbon tariffs. And we can also, because we have analytic formulas for optimal policy, we can bypass some of the numerical complexities that have impeded the past quantitative literature. And by bypassing these complications, we can uncover the full potential of proposals 1 and 2. So that's the idea. So the way I'm going to present this paper is first I'm going to show you the model and then the analytic formulas for optimal policy. Then I'm going to map these formulas to data and give you some numbers for how effective proposals 1 and 2 can be in terms of carbon reduction. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the related literature. So the closest paper to us is this super elegant paper by Sam Cordham and his co-author, which is basically another GE model that looks at the same problem. And a lot of you have already seen this paper because it was, I think, the first paper that was presented as part of this as seminar series. So this is the theoretical framework. It's a many country model, and we're going to use I, J, and N to denote, to index countries. Yes.
Ahmad, sorry, can you go back to the figure with the optimal tariff and the arbitrary tariff?
Is this it?
It seems like the natural question, just to understand if that's the question that you're after, is that the optimal rate may not be sustainable with just trade restrictions. There may not be enough incentives to enforce the optimal rate. And then the question is how far you are from that optimal rate.
That's yes.
To the status quo. Is that the question you're after?
So that's a good point. So we're going to have different situations. So there's this first best globally optimal outcome, which is full cooperation. You cannot get there usually, right? So then there's what is the best we can do with carbon tariffs, and what is the best we can do with the climate club. So we're not going to get to the first best, but we're going to get to a percentage of the first best carbon reduction. Now, to determine the best the climate club can do or the best carbon tariffs can do, you have to set the carbon tariffs optimally and the trade penalties in the climate club optimally. That's difficult, determining the optimal rate. So that's why people say, let's assume this arbitrarily chosen penalty or carbon tariff. What is it going to do? We're going to say, what if we apply the optimal rate? What if we apply the optimal penalty? What is the best we can do? We're still not going to get to the first best, but we're going to determine what's the best you can do with these two proposals that are being articulated by experts. So that's the idea.
Got it. Thank you.
Ahmad, I have a question here. This is Farzad Tahiripur. When you are talking the optimal tax, what do you have in mind when you say optimal? Optimal with respect to what?
So we're going to have an objective function which has objective function which includes utility from consumption, this utility from climate change, and optimal will mean multiple things. So there's a unilaterally optimal policy which is going to be maximizing a country's carbon adjusted utility, and then there's a globally optimum, which is going to be maximizing the global carbon adjusted utility. So that's what we mean by optimum.
And the tax is on CO2?
The tax is going to be on multiple things. It's going to be on CO2, on imports or exports. And the import or export tax will internalize the carbon content of the goods that are being traded. It can also be on output. So we have also industrial subsidies because we have misallocation.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question here, if I may. This is Gabriela Mundata. Yes, so, could you clarify a little bit, because, to determine the optimal tax as depending on carbon emissions, import and exports, but it's just import and exports and carbon emissions are related to each other. How much imports, how much exports determine the CO2 emissions. So, and determining that you say the carbon tax, some papers determine or find the effect of carbon tax, some kind of exogenous tax, right? But it turns out that the carbon tax is also an endogenous variable, and the imports and exports and CO2 emissions are also endogenous variables. So I don't understand what is it that you determine the optimal carbon tax here. Because whatever you have on the right-hand side is going to be also endogenous. It's going to be determined by the carbon tax level.
I mean, that's a very good point. So the formulas I'm going to show you, they're going to be implicit forms. So they implicitly solve for the carbon tax. They're going to be very clear, right? So basically, they're going to depend. For example, the border and carbon tariff is going to depend on some structural parameters. It's going to be a very simple formula. And then the carbon per unit value of the goods that are being imported. And that carbon per unit value, yes, it's endogenous. And when we do our quantitative exercise, we're going to internalize the endogeneity of the carbon intensity of the goods that are being traded. And that's implicitly assuming that when governments apply their optimal policy, they also internalize these adjustments. So I'm going to show the exactly how we do the quantitative exercise, but this is a very good question. So when I get to our formulas, I'm going to again come back to your question and clarify it a little more. But thanks for the question. So I will go back to our theoretical framework. So there are many industries. So going back to the countries, I should mention one thing. So each country is essentially a population ally of workers who supply labor inelastically. And labor is a sole factor of production. And there are many industries, and K and G will denote industries. Each industry is served by many firms. Omega will index firms. And the market structure is monopolistic competition plus free entry. And scale economies are going to be driven by these free entry effects, essentially. It's a Krugman type model. However, a lot of what we say, you can interpret it as external economies of scale. So the model in many ways is going to be isomorphic to a model with external economies of scale. Now, one thing I would like to emphasize at the very beginning before I go into the presentation of the model is that the way we index goods is that we index them by a triplet that identifies where the goods originate from, where they're consumed, the destination where they're consumed, and the industry under which they're classified. So good IJK is a good coming from origin I, going to destination J, and it's classified under industry K. And again, just to give an example, this could be autos that are sold from origin I, say Germany, to Canada, and they belong to the auto industry, right? So then we have some supply side variables and demand side variables that are indexed accordingly. So a supply side variable with subscript IK belongs to origin I, industry K. A demand side variable with subscript JK belongs to destination J, industry K. So that's the notation. And the demand side of this model is very simple. It's just Krugman that is generalized. So we have a non-parametric utility aggregator across industries. The consumer looks at the prices in their income, and they determine how much they want to spend on each industry. Now, the one object I want you to pay attention to here is this indirect utility function. So that's going to show up later in the objective function. And then this whole this optimization is going to give you this Marshallian demand function for industry level demand. If you don't like that, just think about a Cobb-Douglas utility aggregator, which is basically a constant share of your income is spent on each industry. And then within industries, you have the nested CES utility function, where sigma is the cross-national elasticity of substitution, gamma is the subnational across firm elasticity of substitution. So a firm, omega, faces the following demand, which is dependent on its price relative to the price of all the other goods. But then the two parameters, sigma and gamma, gamma is going to determine the markup or the scale elasticity in each industry. And sigma is going to be the trade elasticity in each industry. So these are the two key parameters on the demand side, and they're going to play an important role in our analysis. So,
sorry, Ahmad, but are there variable markups here? I see there's a finite number of varieties.
I think that's a really good question. No, they're not. Maybe I think so. We're assuming that there are a lot of firms here, so you can assume that there's a continuum. Actually, variable markups is one reason we are not assuming a non-parametric demand function within industries. That's the main reason, because it's really the only thing that is going to bug us with is the variable markup issue. So we assume this nested CES in many firms to get rid of the variable markup and have a constant markup.
Fine, just to clarify.
Just to clarify,
yes, so on the demand,
is there any variable in the utility function to represent environmental quality or emissions, anything like that?
So this is a consumer's utility function taking emissions as given. So the consumer faces this utility from carbon emissions, but because they treat it as given, right? So you're going to see it later when I show you the welfare of a country. So it doesn't really interact with their choice of consumption. So they say, okay, this is the emission. You cannot affect it as a consumer. You take that as given. You decide what to consume given prices and your income to maximize your utility from consumption, but the government can affect emissions. So then when I show you the welfare function that the government maximizes, that's going to include the disutility from emission.
So the consumer does not have any choice on environmental quality.
Yes, exactly. That's true. That's true. So the consumer does not, does not make a choice that internalizes environmental quality. That is correct.
So they drive a Prius because they like it.
Yes, here exactly. If they drive a Prius, they like it. And we actually thought about using that, but yes, that's a good, we can potentially add a demand shifter here into the utility function. That will account for that is a function of carbon emissions. So like high quality or high demand shifter will be low emission, right? We can potentially add that, but we don't have it right now. So if it's okay, I'm going to move to the supply side. So the production side is, again, very simple. It's just Krugman with abatement. And the abatement is a la Coupland-Taylor. So every firm located in origin I industry K faces a set of costs, right? The entry cost that is paid in terms of local labor, and then a marginal cost of production, which includes an iceberg cost, and it depends on the firm's productivity. And then this is the key part, right? A fraction A of a firm's input could be devoted to abatement. So by undertaking abatement, the firm makes it's more costly for the firm to produce. So the price goes up, but at the same time, the CO2 emission per unit of output goes down. So that's the trade-off. So the relationship between CO2 emissions per unit of output and abatement is this relationship here, which is governed by this emission elasticity alpha, which is an industry specific parameter. So the higher A, the lower your emission per unit of output and the higher your cost. And we can summarize all of this by aggregating over all the firms in each origin and industry. And then every origin and industry has a price index that is the price the sellers from that origin offer the goods at, and then an emission level. So what is the price index of goods originating from I sold to J in industry K? They depend on some constant cost shifters, the wage, the abatement level, So that increases the cost, a higher abatement, and then the output of the industry. So the higher the output, the lower the price index. So that's where scale economies come into play. And then the emission produced by industry K in origin I depends again on some constant emission shifters, the abatement of that industry and the scale of production. So what we have here is we have scale economies in production and also scale economies in abatement, right? So scale effects on production are picked by this term Q to the power of minus 1 over gamma. So gamma is going to be 1 over gamma is the scale elasticity essentially. And then scale effects in abatement operate as follows. So when you have a 1 over gamma that is not 0, if you undertake abatement, it has a greater effect on carbon reduction. So all of this is operating through firm entry. And a special case of this, just to fix ideas, is a model with constant returns to scale, right? If firms are perfectly competitive or 1 over gamma goes to 0, then these terms kind of disappear. And you have your kind of multi-industry, multi-country Armington model with abatement. So this is the supply side of the economy. Now,
So
what are the
initiation question, please?
Yes, please.
So when you are talking about abatement, do you have a kind of function for abatement technology, or is just an elasticity?
So this is the abate. Okay, so this is the. Let me go back. This is kind of a technology, right? So this elasticity tells you what's the correlation between or relation between abatement and emissions. And abatement is basically the way firms are cost minimizers, right? So you can think of abatement as kind of a factor of production or emission as a factor of production. So you adjust your emissions given the cost of emissions, which is the carbon tax.
So the point here is it seems you have only one elasticity. So this means that firms could invest in abatement rather than an elasticity.
So firms can invest in abatement. Let me see how would you define invest? So firms can sacrifice 8% of their inputs. So if they have labor, like 20% of the labor is devoted to abatement. So every unit of production is now costing more, right? It requires more labor. That's one way to think about it, and that lowers your emissions. So if you think of that as investing in abatement, yes, that's you can think of it that way.
So I mean, I understand that you do not have that one in this framework, but firms can, for example, invest to reduce their emission. Let's say just a simple example. They can install some filters on their pipeline, for example. So you are saying that in terms of labor, but that could be a different kind of things, right?
Yes, no, I'm not saying that this is a general like overarching model of abatement. Actually, if you look at Coupland and Taylor's handbook chapter, there are many extensions to this baseline framework. One of them is exactly what you're mentioning. Another one is that there are scale economies in abatement that do not originate from firm entry. So this is the baseline Coupland and Taylor model of abatement. Yes, you can actually invest in abatement on different margins. So this is one margin.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, a related question. So I'm trying to think of differences in technologies for abatement across countries. So just to be clear, so here the assumption is that richer countries or more productive countries will also be more productive in abatement. Is that correct? Because they're going to be requiring less labor to produce. So then in amount of, per unit of emissions, it will be cheaper. Is that correct?
So the opportunity cost will be higher, if anything. So labor is more valuable in rich countries, right? So the opportunity cost of moving labor from production activities to abatement activities is actually higher in richer countries. But there are ways to actually introduce comparative advantage in abatement by making alpha country specific, or even making the emission function country specific. But we're not actually doing that here because we don't have the data for that. but that will be some extension that is actually very fruitful if we did have better data.
Okay, thanks.
Right.
I'm sorry, just a little, when you go to the next slide, these A and Q are hardly correlated, right?
A and Q are correlated, yes. So Q is output and A is abatement, and abatement is going to affect your price. Your price is going to affect your demand. So everything here is interrelated apart from the terms that have bars. So terms that have a bar notation over them, they're constant.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we'll see how you this. Okay.
So one thing I would like to talk about before I show you the objective function.
One stupid question on the previous slide. What is this D? I didn't see the D showing up.
Oh yeah, so the D bar is this is taking into, this is basically the ice. We can think of it as the iceberg trade cost, and it's a constant cost shifter for origin destination J, and then this is the PII incorporates all the cost shifters that have nothing to do with where you sell to. So these are not going to change with any policy change or any shock to the economy, but W, A, and Q, they're going to change. So
not to okay, I'm gonna because I'm in Minnesota, I'm gonna nitpick. But where'd the tau I J K go?
Wait, let me just go back. So let me.
I think that maybe this.
Yeah. So let me just tell you this.
Is the D?
This is a good point. This is actually a typo. This should be DIJ. I'm sorry for that. I think the reason we call it DIJ, and I wrote this without thinking carefully, is that we're going to use tau to denote carbon taxes. So we didn't want to clash between the notation for carbon taxes and trade costs. So we use the less conventional DIJ. So that's I'm sorry for that. So let me just first tell you what are the inefficiencies in this economy from the perspective of country I. And I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit because I didn't show you the disutility from carbon, but just bear with me and I'm going to show it to you the next slide. So one, firms do not internalize their carbon externality. So that's a problem and governments can address that. Two, industries exhibit different markups. So these gammas are different across industries. So there's misallocation because of markup heterogeneity. And three, there is unexploited import-export market in relation to the rest of the world. So from a unilateral perspective, each country can use its export-import market power to extract surplus from the rest of the world, but that's going to be a beggar thy neighbor type of policy. And then this is what we're going to assume. We're going to assume that governments have access to a complete set of policy instruments in order to correct all three of these inefficiencies. And this is going to be the government's policy space. And then after I show you the government's policy space, I'm going to tell you what the objective function looks like. So first, the government has access to import tariffs, export subsidies, and industrial subsidies. What do these policy instruments do? They create a wedge between the consumer price, which has the tilde notation, and the producer price. So a good that comes from origin I is sold to destination J in industry K. There is a tariff that is charged on that good by the importing country J, an export subsidy that is offered by the exporting country I, and an industrial subsidy that is also offered by the origin country I. And again, the industrial subsidy is different from the export subsidy in that it does not depend on whether you export or not. It's just offered to all firms in a given industry, irrespective of their export status. Then there are carbon taxes. These taxes regulate abatement. So tau IK is the carbon tax in origin I industry K. And because firms are cost minimizers, the abatement a firm undertakes is going to depend directly on the average firm in industry origin I industry K undertakes is going to depend directly on this carbon tax. So carbon taxes are going to dictate abatement, and then these tariffs, export subsidies, and industrial subsidies are going to determine the wedge between producer and consumer prices. Now, Equilibrium is just consumption choices are optimal, production choices are optimal, wage payments equal net sales, and income equals wage payments plus tax revenues. It's just very standard stuff. So this is the optimal policy objective. So each country has a vector of taxes, say country I, tariffs, export subsidies, industrial subsidies, carbon tariffs. Call that vector of taxes T. Then call the taxes in the rest of the world T minus I. Your welfare is going to depend on these taxes, and it's going to be composed of two components. Utility from consumption. This is the indirect utility that came out of the consumer's utility maximization problem. Disutility from carbon emissions. So what is this utility from carbon emissions? It's basically a function of two things. This delta, which is the weight you assign to emissions from origin N. So this is country I. We allow for country I to care more or less about emissions from different locations, right? So local emission, for example, if we're thinking about the US, carbon emissions produced in the US, they could have some externality that is different from climate change, right? So that they could be more important to the US government than emissions happening in China. Then this delta times Z, the total emission of industry K in origin N, is going to determine this utility from carbon emissions. And you sum over all the carbon emission all over the world, right? So your utility from consumption depends on income and prices. And then this utility from carbon emissions depends on carbon emissions all over the world, weighted by how much you care about different locations. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose T for country I, or the vector of taxes, to maximize this welfare function, taking taxes in the rest of the world as given. That's the idea. That's what optimal policy is.
Something I didn't understand. It seems like you could have just said all the delta Ni is equal to 1, because we don't really care where the carbon emissions were coming from.
We can potentially, yeah. So we just want it to be more general.
I mean, what you have might be good for, say, pollution, like air pollution that sits around your cities or something. But somehow it seemed like if you're motivating it mostly by the carbon, then you might as well just go with the simple.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So that's what we were thinking about, actually, that pollution has potentially non-climate change related externalities. And we just wanted this to be general enough to incorporate that kind of externality. But that's true. If we're just thinking about climate change, then it doesn't matter if the carbon is emitted in the US versus China. It's the same. That's a very good point. But I'll come back to these deltas. When we take it to data, we actually infer deltas from the way countries are taxing carbon. And I'll talk a little more about the deltas and how we discipline them when we take the model to data. But let me just talk about one point before I tell you how we actually solve this problem. So the unilaterally optimal policy has a problem, right? Two problems, actually. It doesn't internalize one country I's carbon externality on the rest of the world. So you may not care here that other consumers in the rest of the world also suffer from climate change, right? So it's not just US consumers that are suffering from climate change. Other consumers in China and Canada and EU, they're also suffering. So you do not internalize that disutility. The second problem is that you do not internalize your terms of trade externality on the rest of the world. So when you're maximizing your welfare, you may impose taxes that are benefiting you at the expense of your trading partners. So let me tell you how we approach this problem theoretically. This is going to be a 3-slide summary of our approach. Step one is that we reformulate the optimal policy problem. So instead of governments choosing taxes or carbon taxes, tariffs, export subsidies, industrial subsidies, we assume that they choose consumer prices associated with their economy and abatement levels directly. So they choose this vector P, which is the prices you pay on imported goods, the prices you charge on exported goods, the prices you pay and charge on domestically produced and consumed goods, and abatement level in your economy. So you choose this vector of prices and abatements, and then you can recover the optimal tax rate from this optimal price wedge and optimal abatement level you chose in the reformulated policy problem. Now, this problem simplifies things to some extent. The next step is to derive the first order conditions for the reformulated problem P1. This is where things get difficult, right? So if you look at the traditional literature, yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide? I missed something there, but I thought you were using these tariff tools, or in particular the trade tariff, so that you could manipulate not just AI, but AJ, right?
Oh yeah, you cannot manipulate AJ because you can manipulate Z, carbon emissions. So A is because you cannot directly tax carbon, you're taxing carbon. So this is the thing. If your goods enter a country, if you're a firm and selling to say the EU, the carbon tariff is applied once you sell. So it's not a price on carbon that you emit. It's a basically umbrella tax that applies to all the goods coming from China, say irrespective of what carbon emissions you have. So in this setup, so because tariffs are designed in a way that they're origin, destination, industry specific, right?
Right.
So here you can replicate tariffs with the price wedges. So once you determine what's the optimal price for the goods that come to your country and leave your country, that determines the tariff and the export subsidy. And then when you know the optimal abatement level, that determines the carbon tax you want to apply for controlling abatement in the domestic industries.
Okay, so you're not going to say tariff, impose a tariff conditional on what the other country chooses for the abatement level.
So yes, so the tariffs are, the tariffs do not depend on abatement. But they internalize the units, the origin industry and origin destination industry specific. So they will internalize the carbon emission or carbon intensity of the goods that are being imported.
Got it. Okay.
So the first order conditions for this reformulated problem, the reason it's difficult to write these first order conditions is that this is a GE model. And everything is interrelated. So I just showed you those price equations. The wage depends on quantity, quantity depends on wage, Z depends on both of these. So everything is interrelated. And that's one reason that the traditional optimal trade policy literature has usually avoided these GE complications by looking at partial equilibrium 2x2 models. So the way we overcome this complication is that we produce an intermediate envelope theorem that is actually applies to things beyond this particular setup. It's actually more general. It applies to all these quantitative trade models, is that you can write the first order conditions associated with problem P1 prime, the reformulated problem, as if wages are constant and demand is inelastic. So think about the traditional optimal policy models. They assume demand is quasi-linear, and then the linear good is costlessly traded. So the wage effects they kind of kill the wage effects and kill the income effects. What this envelope theorem or result is saying is that you don't need to do that. Why? Because GE wage effects are welfare neutral when you have a complete set of policy instruments, export taxes and export subsidies and import tariffs, and demand GE income effects are welfare neutral at the optimum. So this first result follows from the Lerner symmetry and the targeting principle. So so I'm not going to go into the details, but that's basically what's going to simplify our problem, is that based on this envelope result, we can basically write down a partial equilibrium set of first order conditions. And then the next step is to solve the system of first order conditions. And the way we're going to solve this system is first, we're going to use the primitive properties of Marshallian demand, like Cournot aggregation, homogeneity of degree 0, to prove that the system of first order conditions admits a unique and trivial solution. And once we know that, we can just invert that system, and that's going to determine the optimal price wedges and abatement, and we can recover the optimal taxes from those price wedges and abatement levels. So that's the idea. And what is the optimal policy? This is what the optimal policy for country I looks like. So the carbon tax is basically equal to that delta. Now tilde means that the delta is adjusted by the price index of country I. So that weight you had in this utility from carbon, the delta, times the price index in country I, that's going to be delta tilde. So the carbon tax is industry blind. It's uniform across all industries. And the industrial subsidies you offer, they're carbon blind. They just restore marginal cost pricing. They do nothing else. So the restore marginal cost pricing, they're equal to the inverse of the markup in each industry. Now, the import tariffs and export subsidies, they have two components. A terms of trade improving component that is standard. So the import tariff is equal to 1 plus the inverse of the export supply elasticity. And the export subsidy is 1 plus 1 over the import demand elasticity. So these are the standard terms that you've probably seen in other papers. But the interesting part is the carbon adjustment. And this is what we liked about this result, is that it's a simple formula. It's not a complicated formula. So we were worried that we will get this ugly looking thing and you cannot go and tell the policymakers to implement this carbon tariff because it's very difficult to measure. But what this is that it's a weight you assign to this utility from goods coming from emissions in origin J, you're the importing country I. And then you multiply that by carbon per dollar value of the goods that are being imported. So again, think about the EU. So you're deciding what's the carbon tariff you're going to impose on goods from China. Delta determines how much you care about emissions from China. Then you look at carbon per dollar value in goods coming from China. And that's also going to show up in your export subsidy. So what is this export subsidy carbon adjustment? If you're the EU and you're selling to a country where your goods are competing with dirty or CO2 intensive varieties, you subsidize your exports. And by subsidizing your exports, you're indirectly penalizing the carbon intensive goods that your exports are competing with. So you're promoting your exports against carbon intensive competition in the rest of the world. The import tariff is penalizing carbon intensive goods that are entering your country. But both of these adjustments have a correction for scale effects. And this correction is smaller than 1. So the higher the gamma, the lower gamma, which means the more the degree of scale economies in an industry, the smaller this shifter. So you have to take into account scale economies. Now, why do you adjust for scale economies? Because if you penalize imports that are carbon intensive, you reduce production scale. And when you reduce production scale, that actually makes the goods more carbon intensive because of scale economies and CO2 emissions. So that's the trade-off you have to take into account. Now, an interesting special case is when gamma goes to infinity. That's going to be your Armington model or a model without economies of scale. Then you don't have industrial subsidies because there is no misallocation. The carbon tax is going to still remain the same. And then you don't have the scale adjustment on the carbon tariff, right? So and then your tariff outside of the carbon adjustment is uniform. So that's the Costano et al. Result in the QJE, right? So in a Ricardian type model, you are going, or in an Armington type model, optimal tariffs are going to be uniform if you're not climate conscious. But if you're climate conscious, you're going to apply a carbon tariff on these goods. So this is the unilaterally optimal policy. And then the export demand, the import demand elasticity in the Cobb-Douglas case, I just wanted to tell you that these are not difficult to compute. It just depends on the sigma and the trade shares. But let me just summarize what I told you on the previous slide. So the local carbon taxes are uniform across industries. Industrial subsidies are carbon blind. But this is the two interesting results. I want you guys to take away from the previous slide. One, scale effects diminish the effectiveness of carbon tariffs. So you're going to lower your optimal carbon tariff if you have scale economies. And that's going to create a problem, especially if your carbon intensive industries are this highest returns to scale industries. So in that case, your hands become tied. On one hand, you want to really tax imports in carbon intensive industries, but on the other hand, you have to adjust your carbon tariff based on the gamma, and that's going to result in a relatively less effective carbon tariff. The other thing is that the terms of trade optimal trade policy may exhibit environmental bias. because in some cases, depending on the sigma or the trade elasticity, your terms of trade optimal policy may ask for restricting trade in clean industries or restricting production in clean industries and expanding production in dirty industries. And that's going to clash with your environmental or climate policy objectives. So that's another thing. Now, what's going to happen if instead of acting...
Can I pause you? So what happened to the misallocation from the markups? Is that's like all tied in with the scale thing too, right? Or
so this is it here. So gamma over gamma minus 1, that's the inverse of the markup, right? So
and then gamma minus 1 over gamma is what's doing the I guess what's I'm confused about is like the misallocation from markups and the scale effects are all tied together.
It's all tied together in a way, yeah, because they have the same origin. Let me actually make it. So suppose we had external economies of scale plus firm entry. Suppose we had that. Then this gamma will include this term, the inverse of the markup, plus the external economies of scale elasticity. In this correction here, it will just be gamma. So the reason these two look like each other is that scale economies in abatement and emission have the same origin as scale economies in production. But that does not need to be the case in a more general model. But that's a good point. I think we have to be more careful in terms of explaining this because, again, this gamma is restoring marginal cost pricing. Now, it looks exactly like this gamma. The reason is that the scale effects that happen in emission or abatement are governed by the same gamma that causes misallocation or markup heterogeneity. That's why
I mean, that's what, but that it seems kind of, it's like there's no kind of tension here that you know what I mean? It's like I can always kind of do everything in the one way I can internalize the scale effect and eliminate misallocation in this particular, like all I need to do is get this one thing in the particular right way. Is that correct or no?
So I'm not sure if that's correct. So basically what this is saying is that even after you restore marginal cost pricing with these inverse markup scale subsidies, you still have to adjust your carbon tariff. So that doesn't make you not want to adjust the carbon tariff. So my intuition before actually going into and solving the problem was that once you restore efficiency in production, you don't want to do anything else that is related to gamma on this carbon tariff. But it turns out that you want to do something to it still. You want to adjust it because there is scale effects that channel through abatement. Have nothing to do with production, basically. Because the effect of your abatement on Z total carbon emissions is adjusted by 1 over gamma.
Yeah, I think that was helpful. I'll keep thinking, keep going.
Can I just jump in for a second? I'm not sure I followed everything what you guys were talking about, but it seems like it's somehow related to the love of variety and markup being interconnected here. So if you were to separate them out in the way that Benassi would that somehow help us to distinguish between the scale effects and the markups?
So I'm going to make it both clear. I'm going to say that we are taking into account Benassi's critique, because his argument is that if you look at the standard Krugman model, sigma and gamma are equal. So it creates an artificial connection between love of variety, the love for national variety, and firm level market power. Yeah. So we're letting sigma and gamma diverge, but we can again add another shifter, so we can make love of variety and markups different again by just manipulating the utility function. Yeah. In that case, that's going to change things. It's going to be a little like what I just mentioned about adding external economies of scale to the mix. It'd
be nice to do it in that sort of general way, and I think that would sort of clarify this a little bit because, yeah. All right.
No, that's a good point. No, thanks for the comment. And that's something we have to probably think about. But thanks for that. Yeah. So one thing I would like to just before going to the quantitative analysis is to understand this unilaterally optimal policy, it's good to contrast it to what will happen under global climate cooperation. So what we previously did was country I maximizes its welfare given taxes in the rest of the world. Now, suppose every country is choosing its taxes cooperatively to maximize global welfare. What's going to be the optimal tax schedule or optimal policy schedule? In that case, again, you're going to have a uniform markup, a uniform carbon tax, the same subsidies, because these subsidies have to be in place to correct misallocation, but no trade taxes, no carbon tariffs, no export subsidies, because these two reasons. One, the carbon correcting term was a second best policy, right? Under the first best, you don't want to use that. The terms of trade part was beggar thy neighbor. It was making your partners worse off. It was making global efficiency worse. So you don't want to impose that part either. So every tax on carbon is lumped on this globally optimal carbon tax. And country I is internalizing now its carbon externality or pollution externality on all consumers all over the world. So it's increasing its carbon tax because it's realizing that its carbon emissions have not only externality on its own consumers, but on consumers in every other country. Now, this global optimum equilibrium can be supported as the outcome of a Nash bargaining game with lump sum transfers, right? So that's the idea. So how are we going to map our theory to data? So I don't have a lot of time, so let me just give you a very brief overview of what we do. So we want to simulate this counterfactual world with optimal policy. So we are in the status quo. We want to know what happens under optimal policy. This is what we're going to do. Use exact hat algebra to express optimal tax formulas and changes. Use exact hat algebra to express equilibrium conditions and changes. Solve them under one system. And the solution to this system of equations is going to determine the changes in welfare in global emissions under optimal policy as a function of some sufficient statistics. Expenditure shares, sales shares, the perceived cost of carbon, which we infer from the local carbon tax countries are imposing. So if a country is imposing a very high carbon tax under the status quo, we interpret that as that country is more climate conscious. If a country is not taxing carbon, we infer that as that country does not care about climate change as much. Then national accounts data, and then some structural elasticity, sigma, gamma, and alpha. Alpha was the emission elasticity. So we need to estimate these elasticities, these sales shares, expenditure shares, we can just take them from data. Now, what is the data we're going to use? We're going to use the World Input Output Database from 2009, because that's the latest version of the World Input Output Database that reports the environmental accounts. And we're going to, so that data allows us to calculate sales shares, expenditure shares, and these national accounts data points where we need. We have 19 broadly defined industries, 33 countries plus the aggregate of the rest of the world. A lot of these countries are EU countries. Ultimately, we're left with 14 countries plus EU. And then we're going to calculate global greenhouse emissions as the carbon equivalent of carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. So these gases account for 97% of greenhouse emissions. So that's going to be how we're going to calculate the emission for each origin in industry. And then we're going to estimate the emission elasticities using tax data from the EU. So we know the carbon tax in the EU. We know the carbon intensity of firms in the EU. So we can infer, if firms are cost minimizers, what the emission elasticity should be to rationalize that type of carbon intensity based on the observed tax rate. So we take data on carbon taxes for the EU from Eurostat and OECD PINE. We estimate the markups using Delacroix's methodology on CompuStat data and the trade elasticity using Caliendo and Paro's methodology on the same World Input-Output database we're using to do our policy analysis.
Excuse me, can I ask you something here?
Yes, please.
Yes, so you're talking about carbon tax, and maybe I've lost here, but carbon tax on what is this? Because nobody has so far any carbon tax on trade, right?
So this is a local carbon tax.
On what? On the level of carbon emissions?
So this is not the border carbon tariff. So this is how much you charge on carbon emissions in the local economy for firms. This is the carbon content of firms is being taxed.
And do you have a uniform tax for that type of product? Is it one uniform? Because, you know, could you please explain the carbon taxes on
So for the
all
EU,
products, all possible products that you are dealing with at the same level? All
let me
cars
just
have the same carbon, fossil fuel has the same different tax. How is that? Because, you know, yes.
So we see the carbon tax collected on goods in different industries. We know the output of that industry, and we know the carbon content of the goods being produced in that industry. So we can infer the carbon per ton of tax per ton of carbon, and then we know the emission carbon intensity. So for the EU, we know what's the carbon tax total. We know what's the carbon content total. So we can determine tax per ton of carbon.
Aren't you dealing with the carbon border tax, no? Because if you are talking about that I'm going to tax this according to the carbon content, then what you are talking today is about the border tax.
So these are different things. So TAU is the carbon tax that is applied to firms in the local economy and on an industry by industry basis. The carbon tariff or the border adjustment carbon tax is applied on goods coming from different countries based on the carbon content. So we're not using the border adjustment carbon tax data to discipline anything. We're using the carbon tax, local carbon tax per ton of carbon to discipline the TAU, the alpha.
But Ahmed, it might be confusing because the EU doesn't have a carbon tax, but just has a cap and trade system. So you're kind of taking the price of a permit as if it was a tax, I guess.
That's actually good. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I think we should be more clear about that. So yeah, we are. This is the equivalent of that, exactly, the carbon tax equivalent of what. Yeah, exactly. So let me to be clear, but it's not. So it has nothing to do though with carbon tariffs. So we're interpreting this as a carbon. We're translating it into a carbon tax, and we're inferring alpha from that carbon tax, which and these are the values for alpha for all these 19 industries.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because you started the paper saying that you're gonna make this tax endogenous, right? It's gonna be optimized, but now you're taking the tax exogenous as well. So
no, we're not taking it exogenous. So let me be clear. So the tax is going to be endogenous because delta tilde depends on the price index. So in our quantitative analysis, remember, we're expressing optimal tax formulas in changes. What does that mean? That means that the optimal tax formulas internalize any change in equilibrium outcomes. So when the carbon content or the carbon intensity changes in response to the tax, the optimal tax rate internalizes that. When the price index changes, the optimal local carbon tax internalizes that. So all of our tax measures internalize any equilibrium change in the carbon intensity and trade shares or expenditure shares.
Ahmad, you've just got a couple minutes left. So why don't you choose what you want to finish to present, and then we can take all this up at the end. We can revisit these conversations.
So, okay, so I'm a little, so can I have like 5 minutes? Is that possible? Or so just because most of the interesting results will follow. So now we're going to look at EU adopting its unilaterally optimal policy. Remember, this is an endogenous policy. It internalizes any equilibrium response. It's based on those optimal policy formulas. We're going to look at two cases. The rest of the world is passive. The rest of the world retaliates when EU adopts its unilaterally optimal policy, which includes border carbon tariffs and local carbon tax. So what's going to happen is that the EU's average border adjustment carbon tariff, when nobody retaliates, is going to look something like this. It's going to average around 3.5% across different industries. But what I want you guys to take away from this graph is that under its increasing returns to scale, which is what the model we're actually interested in, the carbon tariff is lower than under the hypothetical constant returns to scale model. So this is the adjustment based on scale effects. So that's you lower your carbon tariff to account for scale economies. Now, the average export subsidy is going to be 4.2%, but this is the thing. Global CO2 emissions, if the rest of the world does not retaliate and the EU applies its optimal carbon tariffs, is only 0.5%. And EU's emissions actually go up because firms delocate to EU to avoid the carbon tariff. Emission per firm goes down once they come to the EU, but because EU scale of production goes up, total emission in the EU goes up and the rest of the world goes down. Total emission in the world goes down by 0.5%. That's really nothing. If the rest of the world retaliates, then global CO2 emissions will go down by 2.6%. How big is that number? It's only 3.1% of the carbon reduction feasible under global climate cooperation. So again, it's a very small number. And the average country actually loses 2.2% in real carbon adjusted welfare or GDP under the non-cooperative Nash equilibrium. So not only you don't gain a lot in terms of carbon reduction, but because countries are acting non-cooperatively and they're not internalizing their terms of trade or externalities or carbon externalities on the rest of the world, average real carbon adjusted GDP goes down, whereas under global climate cooperation, the real GDP goes up by 7%. So let me just give you some representative numbers. So here is some countries under increasing returns to scale and constant returns to scale. The first thing you notice here is that if we were to model the world economy under constant returns to scale, then the carbon reduction under the non-cooperative carbon tariffs would have been much larger. So it would have been 4.1% of the first best. So firm delocation makes carbon tariffs less effective. That's the takeaway, and scale economies as well. So that's the idea. The other thing I would like you guys to look at is that China actually increases its carbon emissions in this non-cooperative equilibrium. And all of this has to do with firm delocations. Firms delocate to China because they don't want to pay a high tax in this non-cooperative world. The tax comes in the form of tariffs and also carbon taxes, and China produces more dirty goods. It's going to increase its carbon emissions. The rest of the world reduces its carbon emissions, but the overall effect is actually very small. But the other thing is that, again, the welfare effects are higher also under increasing returns to scale. But let me skip that and go to this part, which I think is the most interesting result. How effective is the climate club? So this is how we're going to model the climate club. We start with the US and the EU. These are the core members. They commit to carbon reduction and globally optimum carbon taxes. Now, what are members supposed to do? They apply their globally optimum carbon taxes if they join the climate club, and they also apply optimal terms of trade penalties against non-members. So this is the max penalty you can impose on non-members. And non-members, they can retaliate. So they can also retaliate with their optimal terms of trade, optimal trade penalties. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to compute the outcome of this game. If the Nash outcome has to be identified over all these 10 to the power of n-2 possible outcomes. N-2 is the countries that are deciding whether or not to join the club. So we're going to use this iterative elimination of dominated strategies to shrink the outcome space. And then we're going to use our analytic tax formulas, optimal tariff and export subsidy formulas, to simplify each iteration. This is the result. All countries but China join the club. Why doesn't China join the club? Because one, it's large and it has a lot of export-import market power. So it can survive trade penalties. And it's not climate conscious enough to join the club. The other countries, they're too small. They cannot engage in a tariff war with the climate club members. So even if they don't care about emissions, they're still going to join the club to avoid trade penalties. Global CO2 emissions go down by close to 61%. So that's a big effect. So so the climate club is incredibly effective. So this is a summary of what I just showed you. Border carbon tariffs are not effective. They barely reduce carbon emissions. Why? Because the traded sector is small. So the traded sector accounts for only 48% of carbon emissions. So carbon tariffs are second best policies already. On top of that, they can only target traded sectors, which don't account for the majority of carbon emissions. Climate Club is extremely effective. And first best global cooperation obviously is the best, but the Climate Club can get you very close to that first best full cooperation outcome. And another thing we would like to emphasize on this slide is that increasing returns to scale obviously diminish the effectiveness of a lot of these policies people have investigated before. So thank you. I'm sorry I went over time, and I look forward to comments.
Okay, so we can continue the conversations from before. Or people can ask new questions. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. Have at it.
Hi, this is Farzad Tahirpour again. I have a clarification question on the last slide.
Yes.
So would you please let us know what would be the taxes associated with these reductions?
Okay, so that's a good point. I have, so I don't remember. I looked at them.
10%,
So they're high taxes.
$100, what is that?
Yeah. So maybe Farid can, because Farid ran the code more recently. So when I ran the code, I remember I looked at the carbon. So how much is, Farid, do you remember how much is the carbon tax per ton of carbon in the Climate Club for members?
Yeah, so I think it's just like the tariff, for example, the trade taxes is two components. One of them is just terms of trade. And so the terms of trade component can get to be very big, around like 40% or so. It depends on the industry and the country. But the part which is the border adjustment is typically around maybe 2%, 3%. That also depends. But then in the last exercise, many of those tariffs are not exercised because the point of them is that they are preemptive. So because countries join the club.
Just one, I think there's also the carbon tax per ton of, so the tax per ton of carbon goes up when you enter the Climate Club. So these are the carbon tariffs, right? So these are the border carbon tariffs for the EU, not as part of the Climate Club, but when you join the Climate Club, they're going to be slightly different, again, because these are endogenous optimal tax rates that internalize any adjustments in equilibrium outcomes. But these are around 3.5%. The border carbon tariff is around 3.5%. But then there's tax per ton of carbon. So
yeah, my point here is that I wanted to understand, let's just suppose someone wanted to adopt that policy. What would be the implications in terms of, it may induce $150 shadow price for carbon, $150 per ton, or $250, or something like that. I just wanted to know what is the background of that.
That's a very good question. You're asking about tau IK, and we have to report that. Unfortunately, so our analysis gives a tau IK, which is the tax per ton of carbon that member countries have to undertake to be a member. That's a requirement. If they don't, they're going to get penalized. So tax per ton of carbon, what's that number? I can go back to the output and let you know. Unfortunately, I didn't put it in the slides, and I don't remember the exact number, but that's a very good question.
Thank you. And also, I have a follow-up question, please. So when you calculate, I assume the carbon intensity is carbon per some values, right? $1 million or something like that. So
that's correct.
Yeah, when you're doing that, we need to remember that the prices, let's say food in country X is very different from country Y. So, so have you taken into account that?
The price of what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
When you say $1 million of food, $1 million of food in US is very different from $1 million of food in Egypt, for example, in terms of quantity.
Ahmad, can I answer this question?
Yes, please go ahead.
So the optimal carbon tax, or the formula for the carbon adjustment, always adjusts for the domestic price index of the importer. So it takes into account that.
So actually, that's the exact answer. So let me go back into this formula. So you see this formula. This is the border carbon tariff, right? So delta tilde, when you apply the carbon tariff, changes because the price index changes. That's the price of food and other bundles. The carbon intensity changes. So this term is constant, but these terms change. So when you're writing these optimal tariff formulas and changes, you have to internalize that both delta tilde and nu change in response to any tax imposed on imports or exports or any other good in this economy.
So in notation, delta tilde is just the delta, which is a parameter divided by the price index of the consumer in the origin country or in the tariff imposing country.
Thank you.
Sorry, this is super interesting, Ahmad and Farid. I have a question, more clarifying question, because you had to rush through the quantitative part. So I have two questions, actually. One, the first one is, when you look at those tariffs and the data, do you assume that they are at the Nash equilibrium?
The data, so the data is, we assume the data is definitely not the Nash equilibrium. So we assume that the data is the result of many trade agreements. But once we go to the counterfactual Nash equilibrium, we start from the factual tariffs under status quo, and then we don't internalize any constraints imposed by trade agreements. So that could be a limitation. So we say, suppose countries face no constraints because they're starting to act non-cooperatively, a full-blown tariff war without cooperation ensues, then what will you go, where will you go relative to the status quo tariffs? But the status quo tariffs, they're definitely not the result of a Nash equilibrium in our analysis. And they actually cannot, based on our model, the Nash tariffs should be different from
the carbon tax. Are they set cooperatively?
Okay, so the carbon taxes we assume are set optimally, but unilaterally optimally.
Okay, yeah, no, that's what I meant. Sorry, yes, the trade tariffs is not going to be that way.
Yeah.
Now, then the other point that I was confused about is that usually we think about this, so this argument that you put forth in the very beginning that we're going to use trade to try to induce cooperation on carbon emissions. But I didn't get it from the notation that the tax, that say the tariff you're imposing on imports is conditional on the carbon emission of the producing country. Is that, even if it's not there in the notation, is that it? So it's a tax, variable tax that's conditional on the. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a good question. Let me just make sure this is the correct question. The way I'm understanding it. So in our tariff, this carbon adjustment is a function of nu. So that's CO2 per dollar value. So if origin J has a lot of is carbon intensive, your carbon tariff is higher on the goods coming from that origin. Okay. So it does. So this card does depend on the carbon emissions of
right, but when the country imposes its carbon tax, it doesn't take into account that the TJKIK can decrease if you put a higher tax. It just takes that TIJK import tariff as given.
No, it doesn't actually, because just to be clear, when you impose a TJIK, then you internalize. So this depends on the tariff, right?
No. So it's, if I'm sorry if I'm taking up too much of the other people's time. So say you are Brazil and I'm exporting to Iran, and I'm setting or exporting to the US, just to take a large country. I impose my carbon tax without taking into account that if I put up a higher tax, then the US is going to charge me a lower import tariff.
Okay, I see that. Yes, let me.
Can I answer? I don't know whether I'm answering the exact question you asked, but I think we discussed about this. That's, for example, like in a Stackelberg game.
Yeah.
We can have that, right? But in the Nash game, everybody is just doing simultaneously. So it's not the first mover and the second mover. But what you said, I think is super interesting.
That's possibly why the club gives you so much more leverage. If you have the countries, instead of putting up one tax rate, but putting up a schedule that's conditional on the other country's carbon, then you could get a lot more leverage, right? Off the.
I think you potentially can. I think this is what Farid is saying. I'm sorry to interrupt this conversation, but what Farid is saying is essentially this: is that you condition your optimal policy on taxes in the rest of the world. So you take it as given, because it's as if you're acting simultaneously. But I see your point. I think if you internalize that your tax has an effect on the tariff you have to pay when you export your goods, that could give you potentially more leverage, because I mean, at the end of the day, China stays out. So the question is, will China enter if China were to not play this simultaneous game? It would be playing a game where it internalizes that its carbon reduction affects the tariffs. I actually don't know what the answer to that question is. I have to think about it a little more carefully, but that's a very good question.
Slide right before last, and then I'll show. The question is whether the non-cooperative game would get you a lot closer to the club, because the countries don't put up just a single tariff.
Yeah, that's actually, I see what you're saying. So you're saying that not only the climate club can be less or more effective, but in this last slide, this border carbon tariff, because countries will adjust their carbon taxes in response to the threat of carbon tariffs, you can get a bigger bar for this part. And that's a very good point. Yes, this is something we have to think about more carefully.
Okay. I promise I'd shut up.
Well, that's a very good point. I'm very happy you made that point.
Can I just say something? It is a little bit unclear to me. Is a cooperation about the level of the carbon tax? It is about cooperation participating to impose a tax. What is they cooperating about? Because that is I think is at least for me is confusing. You know, so the club is to what? Usually the club is to participate, right?
Yeah, so the club is basically defined this way. So if you remember this globally optimum carbon tax, which you not only internalize the cost of climate change for your own people, but for all the people around the world, the climate club requires that once you enter, you increase your carbon tax to account for your carbon externality on the entire world population. That's the requirement.
But the level needs to be also determined, right?
Okay, I missed that.
In the club, you have to be determined the level. Because, you know, if you have a different level of taxes, then you will have these leakage problems, right?
Yeah.
So all it has to be for this to be successful, you have to have a uniform tax. Otherwise, you won't be successful. So you will have leakages.
So we are accounting for leakages in our analysis. So the way I understand your question is that we are letting different countries potentially have different carbon externalities on the rest of the world. Now, if that means that as a result, for example, Canada has to impose a lower carbon tax to be a member of the club than, say, the US, then there could be carbon leakage from the US to Canada. Yes, there can be, and that's actually being internalized by our quantitative analysis. So our quantitative analysis is resolving the model given the optimal tax choice, and firms delocate as a result. So when firms are in the climate clubs, there is still some leakage, there is some delocation happening.
Yeah, but maybe that's the reason why you find that not very effective, right?
So the carbon tariffs, the reason I believe they're not effective is partly the leakage, definitely. I think that's a big part, and that's actually evident from the fact that under increasing returns to scale where the leakage is more amplified, the effectiveness is smaller. But another big part of it is that traded sectors that you can impose the tariffs on are just not accounting for a large portion of the carbon emissions. So this is a second best policy that can only target a fraction of the carbon emissions, unfortunately, because it has to be applied to goods that cross the border.
So on a follow-up on Ahmad's answer also is just that, for example, when EU is taxing like imports from every country, it's not taxing carbon emissions of, for example, China creating for Indonesia. So when you think about it, there are many countries, and in that matrix of who is creating externality for who else, there are so many records in that, or entries in that matrix, which couldn't be targeted by border carbon tariffs.
No, but if everybody does that, then you will have not that problem, right? If everybody agree, cooperate, and say, yes, we are going to impose X taxes for every ton of CO2, then you will not have that problem.
That's exactly right. But I think we are calling that full cooperation.
So that's the full cooperation, exactly. So this is the best you can get when everybody agrees, not only agrees, but agrees on the optimal tax rate. So two things, two requirements, one agreement and also optimal rate of taxation. I hope that answered your question. I'm sorry if we misunderstood the question.
Yeah, I guess we are missing something in your question. Sorry if that's the case.
Can I jump in and ask a couple questions? Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so it's really important that you have the three instruments, right? To the way you guys solve this is that then you can basically apply like an envelope theorem and you get the result. But like if you did, that's kind of when you're talking through the way you solved it, is that correct? Like that I'm at the like, let's call it constrained efficient allocation. And then I can just look at direct effects and invert the tax. Is that right? Or
so you're right about so the wage effects being welfare neutral, you need export and import taxes. You need all your export and import taxes for that to go through. For the income effects to be welfare neutral, you need all your domestic price instruments. You need industrial subsidies and import tariffs for that to go through. So as soon as you restrict one set of instruments, then at least one of these neutrality results is going to go away, and the envelope condition only holds in a more limited capacity.
And then, but did you ever do like on the computer at least, like how, if you're not in one of those situations, what's happening? Like because what I want to think about, I'm like thinking from this concrete standpoint is like China isn't going to put the subsidies on or correct the internal misallocation, or the US isn't going to do it either. But what we want to do is find some carbon tax kind of thing that corrects, this global issue of climate change. And so what's,
yeah, so
I'm just trying to think like away from that, like the world that you're looking at, like how far are we from that or not, or
yeah, we haven't
what happens on the computer kind of thing.
Yeah, we have since scenarios where we look at second best policies. Just one thing to a first order approximation, this envelope condition holds if there are small deviations from the first best. But the thing is that we have looked at second best policies, but in a different way, not exact. So the way you're describing it is actually super interesting. So the way we've done it is, suppose you restrict and say trade taxes, right? So governments may start using environmental policy or carbon taxes as protection in disguise, or they may use industrial policies as tariffs in disguise. So we have looked at those, but we haven't actually looked at, so we can do this. We can look at what, our assumption is that under the status quo, governments are not correcting misallocation at all. So that's our assumption. But we could potentially go and collect subsidy data from China and the rest of the world, which is a little difficult. And then see how
but wait. So like, let's go. So the status quo is they're not doing anything. And then
in terms of industrial subsidids, it's only
And then like on the computer, like the stuff that, forget about the club, like you show us what's happening with when we go to your constrained optimum, let's call it that.
Yeah.
But like, what'd be interesting is like, if I saw like, okay, I layer in the different components to get to the constrained optimum where it's all pushing me. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I see. We can do that. So we can always calculate the counterfactual in terms of, changes, and we can always break it down, right? So we can go tell what the constrained optimum is going to give us and then what is it the first best, and we can. But the thing about what makes constrained optimum a little complicated is as soon as you deviate from, as soon as you restrict one instrument, the governments adjust the other free instruments as a second best instrument to mimic the restricted instrument. So as soon as you say restrict domestic subsidies, they're going to use tariffs and export subsidies to mimic, say, Peruvian domestic subsidies. So that's the complication. But otherwise, I think that's
why
a very good.
But that's why it's kind of interesting.
Exactly.
That's what I think. It's kind of interesting to think about that.
Can I jump in and just a quick comment on that? This is not exactly the answer to what you asked. What you asked is super interesting. We should think about it more. But among the second best that we can have neat analytical results is just where export subsidies are banned. Because just if you think about that, that could be also an interesting angle. I think we have,
So I actually have some much less sophisticated questions than Mike's, as usual. So just, it seems like one of the key differences from the paper we saw Sam give a while ago is the fact that you've got, firms in here, right? And so it seems like the delocation issue is really related to like how quickly firms can kind of move from one location to the other location. Have you done a version where you sort of hold the number of firms constant? Does that just get us back to the CRS? And then in the long run, you can kind of think about firms can kind of move locations?
So one, I'm gonna get, so two things. I mean, Sam's paper has something that our paper doesn't have. It's an explicit market for energy. So,
Sure.
So we have this multi-country setup instead of a two-country setup. So I think at the end of the day, you have to put the papers beside each other to get a full picture.
Yep.
We don't see this as like a strict generalization of what they have in their paper, but that's exactly, I think, what the constant returns to scale is doing. So another way to interpret the constant returns to scale is kind of with, it's not exactly that. So we can have restricted entry, like OSA's 2014 AER paper, where every adjustment happens on the profit margin, right? So instead of the number of firms changing, the profits change because firms, basically production activity shifts between different industries. Yeah. So we haven't done that. So I wouldn't call the constant returns to scale benchmark as necessarily treating the number of firms fixed, because in that case, profits have to adjust, but the constant returns to scale basically shuts down profits altogether.
Okay. Yeah, it just seems like in your framework, it's really easy to kind of reallocate everywhere, and in the real world, it's super hard. And so I don't think you have to do a dynamic model, but if there's kind of one step in that direction that can kind of give us some sense of how important that might be, that would be helpful.
Also, just wanted to add quickly, it's just like if you look at these numbers, they aren't super different between constant returns and increasing returns. The reason being that they're not hugely different. That was my point. It's just exactly because of increasing returns, when there is some scale effect somewhere, there is some shrinkage elsewhere. And to some extent, as far as global emission is concerned, they act against each other.
Yeah. No, I mean, I get it. Like everything is in coming up with some cooperative situation, and so everything's going to look small. But something that's 25% bigger than something else, I think in general, I think is a big effect, right?
I'm happy to hear that, in fact, because
no, but I mean,
that the difference isn't large.
But I guess my other question was just, is the U.S. in the climate club in your model? Like, are they the core of the climate club, or are they always on the outside? Like, just as a little bit of a sniff test on they're always in the core, right?
The United States, commits to being a member. So other countries outside of the US,
that seems a little bit hard to, with the current environment. It just seems like you might want to have a framework that doesn't rely on the United States being in the core, since it's been so hard for us to be a leader in this.
So that's a very good point. So before the election, when we were running the climate club, we did it with only the EU. And this is the thing. The EU is not going to be successful by itself. Yep. Only Turkey, in our analysis, will join. because Turkey relies a lot on the EU, so the trade sanctions by the EU will be very costly for it. But the other countries kind of can divert their trade with the EU towards the other non-members. So once you add the US and EU, then that becomes very difficult. So all countries but China enter. So that's a very good point. So I think to get some perspective on what the climate club without the US will get you, it will be EU plus Turkey, and it's going to be much less effective, obviously.
Okay. Great.
If I still have time, I would like to ask a brief follow-up to the leakage question earlier, which is actually related to what you said about the energy market not being there. So typically you would think about leakage in terms of these two channels mostly, which is the delocation that you discuss, and then also an effect via falling energy prices and then other countries making use of that. And I wondered whether this might be something that might change your climate club results. If there would be the second channel, maybe less countries would be willing to join the club because they have like a second gain from staying outside of the club, that they can make use of the, let's say, cheap oil, gas, and coal, as long as they don't have to care about the emissions themselves.
That's a good point. So if I understand correctly, so basically by a climate club will lower energy prices and disincentivize entry because then you can benefit, actually take full advantage of the lower energy prices. I don't know, like I have to think about it. This is a very good question. I have to think about it more carefully, but that's a very good point. We haven't thought about it, unless Farid has anything to add.
Yeah, so with Ahmad, we've been talking also to maybe add like explicitly input-output linkages, but I mean, even this seems like complicated, at least for like notation-wise and making everything clear. But if you have input-output linkages here, or like maybe just for the energy market here, I think that automatically answers the question.
Yeah, so that could be something we can do. But again, I think that's a very good question. I think that's something we have to think about. And one way to potentially incorporate it is with input-output linkages. But I totally see your point. I see why there could be an effect on countries' willingness to enter the club if we account for the energy market.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Thanks.